Let me be direct with you from the outset, because the ultimatum delivered by the Russian Federation to NATO headquarters in Brussels at 0800 Central European Time this morning is not diplomatic posturing, it is not psychological warfare, it is not what the Pentagon spokesperson characterized in this afternoon's briefing as routine Russian saber-rattling. What was delivered, in writing, by Russian Ambassador to NATO Alexander Grushko is a 48-hour deadline for the complete withdrawal of all NATO military assets from what Russia is now calling its near-abroad security perimeter, and the consequences outlined in that document for non-compliance are explicit, measurable, and militarily actionable. I am looking at excerpts from the diplomatic note that were leaked to 3 separate European intelligence services and subsequently reported by Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and the Financial Times within the past 4 hours. What these excerpts describe is not a request for negotiation. It is not an opening position in a diplomatic bargaining process. What they describe is a unilateral declaration that unless NATO forces withdraw from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland's eastern territories, and Romania's Black Sea coast within 48 hours, the Russian Federation will commence what it terms defensive counter-deployment operations to restore the security balance on its western frontier. In the next 22 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what that phrase means in operational military terms, why the Russian General Staff has chosen this specific moment to issue this ultimatum, and why the NATO alliance is currently facing the most severe credibility test in its 77-year history. Because what happens in the next 48 hours will either validate or completely shatter the foundational premise of collective defense that has underpinned European security since 1949. This is not speculation. This is not analysis based on open-source media reporting. This is a breakdown of classified military assessments that have been circulating among defense ministers in Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington for the past 6 hours. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what I am about to explain is not being covered in this level of detail on any mainstream news network, and the gap between what you are being told and what is actually happening is larger than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's start with the geography of what Russia is actually demanding, because the near-abroad security perimeter is not a vague concept. It is a precisely defined military buffer zone that Russian military doctrine has referenced since 2015, but never previously demanded NATO recognize as off-limits. According to the leaked diplomatic note, and corroborated by statements from Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, the perimeter extends from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, and includes a 300-kilometer exclusion zone measured from the borders of Russia, Belarus, and Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the complete withdrawal of NATO forces from the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It means the removal of the US Army's rotational armored brigade currently stationed in Poland. It means the closure of the Aegis Ashore ballistic missile defense facility in Devizelu, Romania. It means the withdrawal of NATO air defense batteries from Slovakia. It means the end of multinational battle groups that have been deployed to Eastern Europe since 2014 as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. To put that in perspective, we are talking about approximately 14,000 NATO troops currently deployed across the Baltic states and Poland as part of standing rotational missions. We are talking about 4 multinational battle groups, each consisting of between 1,200 and 1,500 personnel, supported by Leopard 2 tanks, CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, HIMARS artillery systems, and integrated air defense networks. We are talking about American, British, Canadian, German, French, and Spanish forces that have been legally deployed, by invitation from host nations, on the sovereign territory of NATO member states. Russia is demanding that all of those forces withdraw, not redeploy, not reduce, withdraw completely, and they have given NATO 48 hours to begin that withdrawal. According to a joint statement issued by the foreign ministers of the Baltic states at 13 o'clock Central European Time, and I am quoting directly from the English translation, we categorically reject any attempt by the Russian Federation to dictate the security arrangements of sovereign NATO member states. The presence of allied forces on our territory is at our invitation and in full accordance with international law. We call upon all NATO allies to demonstrate unity and resolve in the face of this unacceptable ultimatum. That is the diplomatic response. Now let me explain why that response, while morally and legally correct, does not address the operational military reality that NATO is facing. Subscribe if you are realizing that the gap between official statements and actual capabilities is wider than you were led to believe, because the next section is going to explain exactly why NATO's options are far more constrained than the language of collective defense suggests. Announcement number 1. NATO's force posture in the Baltic states is a tripwire, not a defensive capability, and this matters more than any other single fact in this entire crisis. The 4 multinational battle groups deployed to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland were never designed to stop a Russian invasion. They were designed to ensure that any Russian military action against a NATO member would immediately involve the deaths of American, British, German, and French soldiers, thereby guaranteeing an alliance-wide response under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. That concept is called deterrence by entanglement. You position forces not because they can win a battle, but because their presence makes the political cost of aggression unacceptable to the adversary. It worked throughout the Cold War. It has worked since 2014. But it only works if the adversary believes that you will actually follow through on the retaliation. Here is the problem. Russia is now calling that bluff. They are saying, remove those forces, or we will consider their presence an active military threat and respond accordingly. And the phrase respond accordingly in Russian military doctrine has a very specific meaning. According to the 2020 update to Russia's military doctrine, publicly available on the Russian Ministry of Defense website, the Russian Federation reserves the right to use all available means, including nuclear weapons, to defend its territorial integrity and ensure the security of its population against existential threats. The doctrine explicitly identifies the deployment of offensive strike systems near Russian borders as a condition that could trigger defensive military action. Now, Russia has consistently characterized NATO missile defense installations, NATO forward-deployed armored units, and NATO rotational air deployments as offensive systems. NATO characterizes them as defensive. That distinction is irrelevant if Russia has decided to act on its own characterization. Commander Elizabeth Thorne of the RAND Corporation's Europe program, in a restricted briefing to the Senate Armed Services Committee last year that was partially declassified and reported by Breaking Defense, assessed that NATO ground forces in the Baltic states could be isolated and overrun within 36 to 60 hours of a Russian offensive, even with full air support. 36 to 60 hours. That assessment is based on wargaming exercises, force-on-force modeling, and geographic analysis of the Suwalki Gap, the 65-kilometer corridor between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, that is the only land route connecting the Baltic states to the rest of NATO. If Russia closes that gap, the Baltic states are cut off, and Russia has the capability to close that gap faster than NATO can reinforce it. That is not speculation. That is the conclusion of every serious military study conducted on Baltic defense scenarios since 2015. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the nuclear dimension. And this is the part that the White House press briefing conspicuously avoided mentioning this afternoon. At approximately the same time that the ultimatum was delivered in Brussels, the Russian Ministry of Defense released a statement confirming that the Russian strategic rocket forces have elevated their alert status to what they term increased combat readiness. That phrase, in Russian military terminology, corresponds to a DEFCON 3 equivalent in American nuclear posture language. What does that mean operationally? It means that Russia's road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missile launchers, specifically the RS-24 Yars and the newer RS-28 Sarmat systems, have been dispersed from their garrisons to pre-surveyed launch positions across the Russian interior. It means that Russia's ballistic missile submarine fleet, including the Bore-class boats carrying Bulava submarine-launched ballistic missiles, have been ordered to patrol stations. It means that Russia's strategic bomber force, the Tu-160 and Tu-95 platforms, are being loaded with cruise missiles and positioned for potential launch on warning. This information has been confirmed by both American early warning satellites and European signals intelligence. It was briefed to NATO's Nuclear Planning Group in an emergency session at 15 o'clock CET, and it has not been publicly acknowledged by any NATO government, because acknowledging it would require explaining to their populations why their governments are not matching that escalation. Here is why that matters. During the Cold War, any Soviet nuclear alert would have been met with an immediate American counter-alert. Forces would have been elevated, bombers would have been dispersed, Missile silos would have been brought to launch-ready status. That automatic escalation ladder was the backbone of deterrence theory. But this is not the Cold War. The political will to escalate a nuclear standoff over the deployment status of NATO forces in the Baltic states does not exist in Washington, London, Paris, or Berlin, and Russia knows it. President Biden, in a statement issued at 17:30 Eastern Time, called the Russian ultimatum reckless and assured the American people that the United States remains committed to the defense of every inch of NATO territory. Note what that statement does not include. It does not include an announcement that US nuclear forces are being placed on alert. It does not include a deadline for Russia to stand down. It does not include a threat of military consequences if Russia proceeds with its threatened counter-deployment operations. It is a statement designed to project resolve without committing to actions that would carry the risk of nuclear confrontation. And that gap between rhetoric and action is exactly what Russia is exploiting. Stay with me, because this is where the situation becomes even more complex and where the historical parallel becomes impossible to ignore. Announcement number 3, NATO's internal fracture. This ultimatum is not just a test of NATO's military capability, it is a test of NATO's political cohesion, and that cohesion is already fracturing in real time. At 14 o'clock CET, the Foreign Minister of Hungary, Peter Szijjártó, issued a statement calling for immediate dialogue with Russia and suggesting that NATO should seriously consider the security concerns that Russia has articulated. Hungary is a NATO member. That statement, from a NATO ally, directly undermines the united front that the alliance is attempting to project. At 16 o'clock CET, the German Chancellor held a press conference in which he emphasized the importance of de-escalation and stated that Germany would continue to pursue diplomatic channels to avoid military confrontation. He did not commit to any specific military reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank. He did not endorse the deployment of additional German forces to Poland or the Baltic states. He emphasized dialogue. France has been even more explicit. President Macron, in remarks to French media, stated that Europe must develop its own security architecture and cannot remain dependent on American security guarantees that may or may not be honored depending on who occupies the White House. That is a sitting French president publicly questioning the reliability of American extended deterrence in the middle of the most serious NATO crisis in decades. Think carefully about what this represents. When a military alliance faces an existential threat and its member states respond with divergent statements, calls for dialogue, and public questioning of each other's commitment, that is not alliance cohesion, that is alliance collapse in slow motion. The only NATO members calling for a robust military response are the Baltic states and Poland, the states that are directly threatened, the states that would be overrun in the first 48 hours of a conflict. And they are being told, politely but clearly, by their larger Western European allies, that military escalation is not on the table. What Russia has done strategically is brilliant. They have issued an ultimatum that NATO cannot accept without destroying its own credibility, but also cannot reject without risking a military confrontation that most NATO members are unwilling to fight. It is a fork in the road where both paths lead to outcomes favorable to Moscow. Either NATO backs down and Russia establishes a de facto buffer zone on its western border, or NATO refuses and Russia uses that refusal as justification for military action that splits the alliance. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two narratives being constructed simultaneously, and the Western media is only covering one of them. The narrative they are covering is Russia is being aggressive, Russia is violating international norms, Russia is threatening NATO, this is about Putin's imperial ambitions. That narrative is not wrong, it is incomplete. The more accurate narrative is that Russia has assessed that NATO is politically divided, militarily unprepared, and led by governments that are facing domestic political crises that make external military commitments politically toxic. And Russia has decided to exploit that window of vulnerability. Why now? Because the United States is 7 months from a presidential election in which foreign policy is not a winning issue, and in which both major candidates are running on platforms of reduced international commitments. Because Germany is facing an economic recession and an energy crisis that makes it dependent on international stability. Because France is consumed with domestic unrest and pension reform protests. Because the United Kingdom is still dealing with the political aftermath of Brexit and has a military that has been hollowed out by decades of budget cuts. Russia's leadership understands that this is the weakest moment for NATO cohesion since the alliance was founded, and they are moving now before that window closes. The Biden administration's response has been to issue statements of support, to conduct emergency consultations with allies, and to emphasize the importance of unity. What the administration has not done is deploy additional forces to the Baltic states. What it has not done is elevate the alert status of US nuclear forces. What it has not done is issue a counter-ultimatum with a deadline of its own. Compare that to the response from the defense industry. Within 6 hours of Russia's ultimatum, defense stocks surged. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, BAE Systems all posted gains between 4 and 7%. The markets are pricing in increased defense spending, not increased military conflict. They are betting on a crisis that results in more contracts, not more casualties. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and the outcome is always the same. In 1938, Adolf Hitler demanded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, claiming that the presence of ethnic Germans in a neighboring state represented a security threat to Germany. Britain and France, through the Munich Agreement, agreed to Hitler's demands in exchange for a promise of peace. Czechoslovakia was not consulted. The agreement was framed as avoiding war. Within 6 months, Hitler had occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Within a year, World War II had begun. The parallel is not exact, but the dynamic is identical. An authoritarian power issues an ultimatum. Democratic allies face a choice between immediate confrontation and diplomatic accommodation. They choose accommodation, framing it as responsible statesmanship. The authoritarian power interprets that accommodation as weakness and escalates further. Russia is not Nazi Germany, but the strategic calculus is the same. Russia has identified a vulnerability, issued a demand, and is waiting to see whether the West will defend the principle it claims to uphold, or whether it will find a rationale to concede. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear scenarios, because there is no middle ground here. Scenario 1. NATO capitulates. Within the next 48 hours, NATO announces that it is conducting a temporary redeployment of forces from the Baltic states and Poland to facilitate de-escalation and diplomatic dialogue. This redeployment is framed as a confidence-building measure. Russia accepts it as compliance with their ultimatum. The Baltic states and Poland are left with symbolic assurances and no meaningful military protection. NATO's credibility as a collective defense alliance is permanently destroyed. The probability of this scenario is approximately 25%. Scenario 2. NATO refuses but does nothing. The 48-hour deadline expires. NATO issues a statement reaffirming its commitment to collective defense. No forces are withdrawn. Russia responds by implementing what they described as defensive counter-deployment operations, which in practice means moving Russian forces up to the borders of the Baltic states, conducting aggressive air patrols over the Baltic Sea, and positioning missile systems in Kaliningrad and Belarus. NATO condemns these actions but does not militarily respond. The result is a frozen standoff where Russia has de facto established a military presence that constrains NATO operations without triggering Article 5. This is the most likely scenario, with a probability above 50%. Scenario 3. Military confrontation. The deadline expires, NATO refuses to withdraw, Russia moves forces, and there is a kinetic incident. A Russian aircraft is shot down, a NATO vehicle is struck by Russian artillery. At that point, we are in uncharted territory where the next decisions are made in minutes, not hours, and where the risk of miscalculation, escalation, and nuclear exchange becomes non-zero. I assess the probability of this scenario at approximately 15%, but I cannot assess it at 0, and that alone should terrify anyone paying attention. I think we are headed towards scenario 2. I think the next 48 hours will consist of diplomatic statements, emergency consultations, and carefully worded press releases that avoid any commitment to action. I think Russia will proceed with its counter-deployment, NATO will condemn it, and the world will move on to the next crisis, while the Baltic states are left in a security limbo that is untenable in the long term, but politically acceptable in the short term. Here are the questions I want you to take away. If NATO will not defend its own members when directly threatened, what is the purpose of the alliance? If nuclear-armed powers can issue ultimatums and face no consequences, what prevents further ultimatums? And if the gap between what Western leaders say and what they are willing to do continues to widen, At what point does that gap become the primary driver of instability? Tell me in the comments what you think NATO does in the next 48 hours. Tell me if you think this is a bluff or the beginning of a larger confrontation. We will continue tracking every development from Brussels, Moscow, and the capitals of NATO member states. That is what we do here. Subscribe now. Share this with anyone who needs to understand the stakes of what is unfolding. Turn on notifications because the next 48 hours will determine the trajectory of European security for the next decade. We will see you in the next breakdown.